Hi, and welcome to the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest today is Robin Naidu, lead scientist at the World Wildlife Fund US. And today we're talking about what happens when you put GNSS receivers on elephants. So one thing that really stood out to me when I reflect on this conversation had nothing to do with the technology or the analysis or the data itself. It was that collaboration is really hard, but really important. And even though we might instinctively know that all of us are better than any one of us, this doesn't mean that collaboration is easy or inevitable. And sometimes we need to accept the risks and do it anyway. And if we do that, we'll be able to make things, we'll be able to do things that simply weren't possible before. I also want to mention here in the introduction that there'll be a few links in the show notes today. I'll put some links to articles that have been published around this field study. And I'll also link to something called MoveBank, which is a free online database for animal tracking data hosted by the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. I haven't a chance to dive into this myself, but it sounds fascinating and I think you might enjoy it. So check it out. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's hear from Robin, lead scientist at the World Wildlife Fund US. Hi Robin, welcome to the podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about some of your work around tracking elephants using GPS data. And we'll dive into that in just a second. But I think it's a good idea to introduce you. You are the lead scientist at the World Wildlife Fund US. Would you mind just putting some more words around that, please? Who are you and what does it mean to be the lead scientist at the World Wildlife Fund US?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And thanks a lot for having me on your show. I'm really pleased to be here. As a lead scientist at WWF, I guess I have a variety of tasks that include things like technical support to our field programs around the world, applied scientific research on various topics that relate to wildlife conservation, and then just general advice and guidance to our team and to the organization in terms of things that have some sort of scientific aspect or relevance for our conservation mission.
Would you mind sort of giving us a bit of more background? How did you get there? What were you doing before? What does your sort of scientific journey look like?
I'd say it was a bit of a different scientific journey than most people who come out of a PhD graduate degree. Most of my cohort went into academia, so they were looking for faculty positions at universities. And I knew right from the beginning that that was something that I wasn't really interested in. The problem is coming out of a PhD degree, that path that I just mentioned is the default one, and it's not necessarily obvious or apparent what other alternatives there are. So I was sort of struggling a little bit towards the end of my degree, but I happened to get a scholarship from the Canadian government, a fellowship for a postdoctoral research project. And as luck would have it, I was in Washington, D.C., and managed to meet with the chief scientist at the time at WWF, who said, "Hey, why don't you do your postdoctoral fellowship with us?" And it sort of started there, and 20 years later, here I am still with WWF.
Wow. Do you have any advice for people that are in that similar position as what you were? They're finishing up a PhD and not really sure where to go or what to do. And the reason I ask is a fair amount of people that listen to this podcast will be in that situation. And I guess they'll be struggling with some of the same things that you did.
It was a lot about trying to be resourceful and self-sufficient. So, other than the sort of tried and true academic path, it can be quite difficult to figure out what options are available. So I don't think I have any particular wisdom or insight other than, trying to keep an open mind, cast your net wide, use your professional colleagues that you've made contact with during grad school, and investigate what things are out there. It's not something that is going to necessarily come easily, but I think if you're persistent about it and again, cast your net quite widely, there's a good dose of luck involved there too. And, in terms of who you happen to meet along the way. But I think there's maybe more of these non-conventional alternatives out there than people realize. It just takes a little bit of digging to uncover them.
Yeah, I could imagine that being the case. And I could also see the value of a network here when you're saying cast your net wide. I think this would be easier if you have a good network and maintain that over the years.
Exactly. And I think it's one of the things that maybe we don't get taught formally in graduate school, just how important that is. We focus on theories and concepts and techniques and methods, but I think it can be just as important cultivating and maintaining that professional network, because ultimately I think that's going to, dictate just as much as your sort of technical qualifications where you end up going.
Yeah, and I realize that was a little bit of an aside, but I appreciate your input there. So the main topic of this podcast is your study. So you've been tracking elephants, you've been mapping their movements. Would you mind sort of briefly introducing the study to us, please? And then we'll sort of jump into the details from there.
Yeah, so the study takes place in the world's largest terrestrial transfrontier conservation area. And what that is an area that's about 500,000 square kilometers in size, so about the size of France. It takes in 5 countries in southern Africa, so Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And this isn't one big protected area, it's a network or a mosaic of, yeah, things like national parks and game reserves, but also things like communal lands, private properties, tourism concessions, and so forth. And the idea of this large conservation landscape is that it is interconnected. And so the large species of wildlife that live in this area, things like elephants and zebra and buffalo and so on, have the freedom to roam across national borders, inside and outside of parks, and so on, so that this is, truly a connected transfrontier conservation landscape. The problem is that it's difficult to know whether that's the case. Is this landscape connected or not? To what degree is it connected? All of those questions are things that we really need data to answer. And so this study was really aimed at addressing that for the largest species that lives in this transfrontier conservation area, which I'll call KAZA, which is the Kavango-Zambezi transfrontier conservation area. So there's about 227,000 elephants that live in this area. And the question we wanted to answer is, how do these animals move around this huge landscape? Are their movement needs and space use needs being met? If not, where are they threatened and what can we do about it? So that's really the background to this study.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. How did you go about collecting this data?
So this is a data set that involved many different people, many different institutions and actors within this transfrontier landscape over the last 15 years. So in as much as the technical details that we'll talk about as we go on through the podcast, I think it's important to really emphasize that without sort of a spirit of trust and collaboration amongst all of these different collaborators from 5 different countries who speak different languages, had different initial aims with their work, it was truly sort of in the spirit of collaboration and for the purpose of conservation that we all got together, pooled these data to answer questions in ways that we wouldn't have been able to if we hadn't been able to collaborate like that.
Was there any sort of risk involved for these different partners in terms of collaboration and sharing the data?
Whether the risk is real or perceived, I think there are risks that are viewed by stakeholders and any scientist with sharing their data. And I think that typically revolves around loss of control of the data that you've put lots of blood, sweat, and tears into collecting, the fear that it might be used in ways that don't reflect your original or primary aims, that it might be misused and so misrepresent the type of work you've done. So I think those are common fears, the fear of getting scooped, that you maybe are no longer now able to publish something in the scientific literature as the first group of people. These are common fears that scientists have around sharing data, and they can be very legitimate and real fears. And I think, again, one of the sort of big successes of this project was really overcoming those fears and establishing this trust and spirit of collaboration that allowed us to answer these questions that we'll talk about.
I think it's really important just to highlight that just for a second, how important it is to have empathy for other people. Like, what do they think they're risking, whether it's real or perceived? It doesn't matter. The point is, there's a risk there for them, and if you want to do this kind of work and share this data and have this kind of collaboration you're talking about, it's important to understand what these other people are thinking, because the goal is, of course, is to move forward, is to do scientific work that is going to make things better.
Absolutely. We see plenty of examples where, those type of barriers don't get overcome. And so the fact that we were able to overcome that for the lion's share of people working on this topic in this area was really gratifying.
Okay, so we've talked around it a little bit. We talked about the data. We talked about sort of the overarching goals of the project. What is the data? How did you collect it? How did you track elephants?
Yeah, so basically the main way that this occurs, or the way that produces the most sort of high resolution, accurate locational data on where elephants are is simply to attach GPS collars to these animals. And I say simply, it's actually not so much of a simple procedure. So, typically what happens is you identify a particular herd of elephants from the air, from a helicopter. You zoom in low with the helicopter. A vet darts the animal. The animal goes down within a few minutes and it is immobilized. And you go in and put a tracking collar on its neck. Yeah, you wake it up and you make sure the animal's okay. And off you go and you repeat the procedures. What that does is allow this individual animal to be tracked at very, very precise spatial and temporal resolution. So these GPS satellites are typically accurate to a few meters. So you know where these animals are to within a few meters anywhere on Earth. And because you're dealing with an elephant that is a huge animal, and so you can put quite large batteries on these collars, you can get intervals as fine as a few minutes in terms of successive GPS locations. There's always a balance between how many GPS positions are you able to record and how long the collar lasts for. We were typically working with data and elephant collars that produced movement locations every 1 hour. So you can imagine. And so we were able to bring together collaborators who are doing this type of research over the last decade and a half and assemble 291 GPS collared elephants. All in all, that amounted to almost 4 million GPS positions. So really, we're working with a huge data set that essentially told us where these 291 elephants were moving around this transfrontier area. And so it's that data set that really allowed us to sort of ask this question about how connected is the KAZA landscape for elephants.
Would you mind just putting this in perspective for the listeners, please? So you've had collars on 291 elephants. You described the process of getting the collar on them, and I'm assuming it's a similar process to get the collar off them again. It sounds complicated. We need helicopters, we need vets, we need to neutralize this large animal, put a collar on it, and then wake it up. Is this a big study? Is 291? Is that a huge amount of collared tracked elephants?
As far as we understand, Daniel, it's the largest number of GPS collared elephants that have ever been assembled for any one particular study. So, yeah, it's a huge number. And one of the reasons it's a huge number is getting back to the point that we mentioned earlier that, this is an effort typically is beyond, what any single research group could produce because these collars are expensive. The collar itself is expensive to buy, but then, as you mentioned, the helicopter, the veterinarian, the drugs, the hours of people time, all of this is quite expensive. And so, this is a much larger sample size than any one research group is typically able to achieve on their own. And so again, the importance of collaborating among different stakeholders, different research groups to build a data set of this size.
And over what time frame did this data collection take place? Are we talking years, decades?
Yeah, we're talking 15 years. So from 2009, when the first research group put on collars, to 2023, 2024, when these collars were still active, and when we finished our analysis and started writing this paper.
Okay, and I guess the obvious question now is, well, what did you discover when you looked at all of these mapped elephant locations? What did you find out, considering that your topic was connectivity?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and because we had a data set of this size, we took a slightly different tack or approach compared to what most of the studies in this field do. So most of these studies are using sample sizes of tagged animals that are much lower than ours, and so they rely on models and extrapolation to look at connectivity across landscapes. Because we had such a huge data set, we were able to look directly, essentially, at where animals are moving. One of the tricky things about the study was because we had so much data, it was actually a challenge to just try and visualize it. So, how can we visualize 4 million GPS points on a map? Your listeners will understand that that's a lot of points. And when you you typically put that number of points on a map, all you get is a wall of color. So we had to try and think about techniques that could allow us to visualize this amount of data in a way that would give us insight and allow us to generate hypotheses that we could then test. And we did that using some techniques involving drawing lines, transparencies, things that have been used in the human transportation literature previously, where this sort of huge big data set is more common. What that allowed us to do was to realize that connectivity operates at a variety of different scales. So there's different types of movement processes that elephants do, whether it's quick directed movements where they're going towards a river to drink water and move out, or longer treks across the landscape where for whatever reason they're trying to cross from one protected area over to another distant protected area. And we realized that we needed to treat these differently. So one thing that was unique about our study is that we looked at connectivity at multiple scales. So we looked at very fine scales, what we call microcorridor movements, when elephants are typically moving between human settlements or other pinch points on the landscape to gain access to water, typically. At the largest scale, we looked at entire movement trajectories of elephants, which can be up to thousands of kilometers long, and tried to identify those areas that were really sort of hubs or conduits of movement for these long trajectories across many elephants. And then, protected areas are really a cornerstone to the biodiversity conservation goals of an organization like ours and many others. So we looked at where pathways between core protected areas in this transfrontier landscape occurred. So that's something that's, that's different than other studies in this field, which typically sort of use one single scale to look at how connected a landscape is.
I don't know if you mentioned barriers, but I'm imagining they're part of this when we think about connectivity, and you talked about pinch points and you talked about corridors. Did you have those mapped out already? Did you know where fences were, maybe geographical features in that, that were naturally going to channel the animals in a certain direction? Or did you see this from the data? Oh, all these tracks are coming together here, kind of thing. Or they're bouncing off something here and they're following it along and then going that way. So my question is, how much of this did you know already, could you see in the data that you had, and how much of this did you discover through looking at the data, looking at these GPS points?
Yeah, it was kind of a mix of both, Daniel. So we did know the location of, there are what are called veterinary fences in this area. They were originally put up to keep livestock and wildlife separate, and they continue to do their job, unfortunately, from a conservation point of view, quite well. So they act as a pretty substantial barrier to female elephants, and more importantly, their calves, their young, which have difficulty crossing through these barriers. So that's an example of an artificial, a human-made barrier. Rivers exist in the area. They're sort of natural barriers. I mean, elephants are quite capable of crossing most of the rivers in this area. But for whatever reason, they tend to act as a natural barrier. Elephants will often stop. I mean, they'll be drawn to rivers for a drink, and they often seem to form sort of a natural boundary to their home range. And so we understood where these sort of more obvious barriers were using these data that covered such a massive amount of real estate across this transfrontier area. What it allowed us to do was to pick out areas maybe that were less well known, less well studied in this landscape, and to see that, the signals that we see here in this very well studied part of the landscape, where we can see that elephants are dashing in and out between human fields and settlements to get to the Okavango River, for example, to drink. We're seeing a similar pattern of movement in this area where we hadn't necessarily appreciated that was occurring. So while we did have some understanding already of some of these barriers and pinch points, what our data allowed us to do was unlock this understanding in a consistent way across this entire vast area.
So this is just speculation on my behalf, but I'm imagining that people have already thought about corridors before and maybe tried to arrange some of these features in such a way that there was still room for the wildlife. And if that's the case, through the data, through analyzing this data, could you figure out if it was working or not? Are the corridors, the work that's already been done, are they working? And if so, or if not, why not?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because, if you just look at a shapefile of all the sort of corridors that have been designated throughout this transfrontier conservation area, they'll vary in their size and their shape. But other than that, they look the same on a map, and you have no idea really of how functional or intact they are. What these data allowed us to do, this vast elephant movement data set, is to really understand and prioritize which of these corridors are the most important. And so some of those corridors we were aware of their importance. For example, there's a small, what's called a micro corridor in Namibia between two protected areas that is heavily used by elephants to move between Zambia, through Namibia, and into Botswana. And we already had a pretty good idea of that corridor because a lot of work had already been done in that part of this transfrontier landscape. But what we didn't know is not too far to the north of that in Angola, which is a much less studied landscape, we were able to pick out two additional movement corridors that had very similar characteristics to the well-studied one. So it's again an example that even though we have some idea of what's going on across the landscape already, by assembling this huge data set of elephant movements and applying an analytical and visualization approach in a consistent way across this entire landscape, we're able to pick out corridors that we hadn't appreciated they were there, or we hadn't realized how heavily used they were.
I guess the question I have now is we keep referring back to this huge data set in it, and please don't misunderstand me here. It is a huge data set, and I appreciate the amount of effort that's gone into it. But my question is, why map this? I understand the need for resolution, but could we have done this study, this research at a much smaller scale and modeled it?
We could have. And in fact, that's exactly what happens in a huge part of the literature. And, in part, that's for good reason. As we touched on earlier, it's expensive, it's logistically difficult, it can be dangerous to get collars on, the types of animals that we're talking about here. And so, in those instances, when people are limited in terms of their budgets or their opportunities to deploy these collars, there's really no alternative but to take your set of collars that you do manage to acquire, to examine how animals move around the part of the landscape where they do move, and to develop a model, that essentially says, okay, these animals move in this direction and at this distance as a function of land cover type, of distance to river, of distance to the nearest human settlement, and so forth. And then once you've got a model like that that's based on these observed covariates, which are often derived from remote sensing in GIS layers, you can then extrapolate that model across your entire landscape. The problem with doing that is that, as we know, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Some are more useful than others. And the problem is when you're working with a very small data set collected from one part of a landscape and trying to extrapolate that to areas far beyond where the movements occurred, under different environmental conditions, where you're dealing with a small subset of individuals that maybe don't represent the movements that you might see if you had a bigger sample, you're introducing a lot of error into this process. And so while we could have done that, what we were able to do in our study is really free ourselves from those models and the pretty strong assumptions that go into them and just observe things directly. So we didn't need a model to tell us the likelihood of animals moving between protected area A and protected area B in our landscape, because we could just look at how many pathways connected those two protected areas. One of the real strengths of our study is that we were able to observe things directly rather than resort to modeling.
Which makes a lot of sense. It'll be interesting to see how people lean on this study, this data set in the future. I guess if it's one of the bigger ones out there, or maybe the biggest one out there in the world, it'll be interesting to see what other research comes off this and how people use it to support maybe existing models.
I think that's a big area that really needs to advance further in our field, like comparing, the models that we use to predict connectivity get more and more sophisticated. As you and your listeners will know, the amount of remote sensed data that's out there continues to grow. It continues to become more accurate, more highly resolved, at finer resolutions, and so on. But at the end of the day, these are, again, models, and models are stronger when they're validated against actual observed data. And I think, one of the points from our study that could really be used as a springboard is to encourage people to try and validate the models that are being used against observed data, when and where it exists.
Again, it makes a ton of sense to me. I was just thinking that GPS data, we get a location and we get time. Did you enrich that data set with anything else? And, just off the top of my mind, I'm thinking weather. What was the weather like when these movements were happening, if that had an impact on things or could have an impact on the way they were moving, where they were going? I'm thinking about food availability. I'm thinking about the change of seasons. Was that something that you did?
We harnessed a variety of different remotely sensed layers. Key one was land cover, so vegetation types. And then, others were things like, how far an animal was compared to a linear boundary like a river or a road or a fence. And then where were people making use of this landscape? So those factors all went into how we interpreted our data. The other thing that I should point out is that, yes, the GPS fundamentally is composed of a timestamp and the location. But because we're dealing with successions of GPS points, we can calculate things like speed, we can calculate things like directionality. And both those two attributes, speed and directionality, were really fundamental in identifying, let's call it a footprint of how elephants behave in these small scale movement corridors. So we were able to identify the signal of how elephants move in these corridors because our colleagues who are collaborators on this project had, in one part of our landscape, studied for years, just where these micro corridors were and how elephants were using them. So completely independently of the data set that we were working with. But we were able to then pick out these movement parameters in these well-studied micro corridors and sort of look for other areas that weren't as well studied in this transfrontier landscape to identify where those patterns were also occurring. So yeah, although it's fundamentally about time and space, as so many things are, there's a lot of additional information and parameters that you can derive from those sort of original data.
This might sound like a really silly question, but when you're talking about how they move in the micro corridors, how is their movement different in a micro corridor from, I guess, more of a free range situation? What do you notice when you look at the data?
Well, three main things, I guess. These micro corridors, particularly where there aren't very many options, and that tends to occur in areas of the landscape that's heavily settled by people. So in these areas, people have villages and fields, and they're doing the best they can to make a living. And there aren't that many options for elephants to move to key resources, and in particular, water in these types of landscapes. So what happens in these areas is that the corridors that do remain are very heavily used. So there's a high intensity of use in these areas. Elephants are moving very quickly in and out because it's generally an area they perceive as being potentially dangerous. They don't want to spend a lot of time in that area. So they're moving very quickly to get water and then back out away from the water source. And then they also tend to be all moving in the same direction. So it sort of, again, goes along with the speed, but they're not sort of meandering about and taking their time, wandering around, looking at this and that. They are moving in a very directed, fast way into and out of these micro corridors. And so that's a very clear signal that we used to examine, this type of behavior across the landscape. And again, it helped us identify some of these areas that we weren't aware of before we did this study.
Given that they're moving in this fashion through the micro corridors, can you say that the corridors are functioning the way they are intended?
I think they are, but I think to fully assess that, we need some independent observations, say on habitat intactness. Are these corridors in a relatively intact state in terms of their vegetation, or are there cultivated fields that are going into these areas? Has a fence been strung across it? So on the one hand, if elephants continue to use these areas, then of course that's a good thing. On the other hand, there's going to be some component of learned behavior, of habituation, of memory, where elephants may continue to act in such a way and move in areas that, may previously have been corridors, but say now have been degraded and are being used, more and more by people. So I think it's a combination of the observed elephant movement data, but this is also where, the remotely sensed data that we get from satellites or other types of observations is really critical to put these movements into context.
So now that we understand a little bit of the results of your research, could you put this into or tell us what the broader implications of your findings are for wildlife?
I think what it really does is emphasize the need to look across different scales. So if we were doing a sort of out of the box, for lack of a better term, connectivity analysis, I honestly don't think we would have picked up these micro corridor movements. It's just such a small scale, and it's so difficult to pick out these types of areas just based on remote sensing that it really behooves us to continue to look at actual observed animal behavior, particularly at these smallest scales. So I think that's sort of a take-home message from the work that we've done. The other is that, it's typically viewed as unattainable, unachievable to get the types of sample sizes of collared animals that we're able to do here for elephants. But I think, what we were able to show, quite apart from all the sort of technical data analysis and visualization and so forth, is that if you can collaborate with other research groups who have similar aims, but are doing things independently of you, you can really raise that sample size and really raise the power that you have to look at these types of patterns. And we are seeing more and more of that in the field, these sort of larger collaborative efforts, whether it's looking at migration, other types of animal movements, connectivity, and so on. We are seeing more and more of those collaborations. And I think, what I hope this study does is, yeah, lends a sense of optimism that this type of process, if it can be achieved here in KAZA, where you're dealing with different countries, different governmental ministries, different groups of people who speak different languages and have different sort of cultures and histories. If we can do that in an area like this, I think it can be done in a lot of areas.
That is really fascinating that one of the main takeaways is collaboration is possible. And you sharing data can be fraud. But I thought in the scientific community, there would be more willingness to say, hey, look, I've got this. How, you've got that. Let's make something great.
Well, I'm glad you have that that vision. I think, I think it's not always that easy, because different research groups will have incentives to not do that type of sharing, to sort of gain the sort of publicity and prominence that publishing a study, by yourself or only within your research group garners. Some of the incentives, particularly in academia, I don't think are all that amenable to data sharing. But I do think there are more and more examples of this type of thing happening. And I think it's particularly important to do when you're dealing with sort of large scale phenomena that are difficult to address with the resources that any typical university, laboratory, or research group might have. And so I do think we will see more and more of this type of collaboration. And I think it's facilitated by the type of tools that are available that can now make data sharing easier. So, online platforms, spaces where analysis can occur that everyone can access and things of that nature. So I do think we will see more and more of it, even if historically, the incentives to do this type of collaboration maybe haven't been there as much as we would have liked.
Again, I find that absolutely fascinating. And I'm pleased you mentioned the tools there. So it's one thing, this human side of it to address people's fears and maybe the perceived risks around, or perhaps real risks around collaboration, but also recognize that the tooling around this kind of work is making it easier for us to do this. I'd like to go back to the data just for a second, if I might. And I'm curious, if you had to do this study again and could put another sensor on these elephants, what would you do? What sensor would you put on them?
I think it would be absolutely fascinating to have a camera on these collars. And we're starting to see this a little bit in other systems. So I saw a really interesting presentation last year by a woman who was working on the Tibetan wild ass. And this is a social animal like elephants, so they're in herds. And she just had some fabulous footage of what the other animals in that herd, aside from the one that was collared, were doing. So, I think that just really unlocks, a whole side of movement and of what these animals are doing in their natural habitat that you don't get. You don't just get from the speed and the GPS position and the time and so on. So, in hindsight, and if resources had been unlimited, I think that would be really fascinating because it would be really interesting to see if, okay, this animal that's collared that's now going on a long walk between these two protected areas, is it by itself? Is it with a large herd? Who are the animals that are with it? What are they doing? That kind of thing. So if it's a question of putting another sensor on, that's what I would have done. If we're talking more generally about, what would I have done differently in an ideal world, in terms of sampling of these elephants and deploying collars, we're typically in a position where you have to take what you can get. It's not necessarily easy to locate animals. You're limited with time. So you end up with a sample that's not random across the landscape. And so if I could go back and in a perfect world, had access to a perfect world with unlimited resources, I think deploying these collars in a more random way and perhaps more representative across the entire landscape, that's something that I'd like to do. I do think there's pretty good evidence that we managed to collar in most of the areas where elephants are in high densities. But you can always do better, and that's something that I would have loved to have done in an ideal world.
That's fascinating. I can't help but focus on the idea of putting cameras on elephants and what that might mean. So obviously, you gave a few examples. I wonder, depending on where the camera was pointing, if that could give you an idea of the health of some of these corridors as well.
Yeah, depending on the field of view of these cameras, absolutely. some of the sort of disturbance to these corridors is visible via satellites, but if it's very small scale, it may not be. And of course, if it's under a canopy of trees, you really don't see what's going on under there. So, absolutely it could give that. And when you said health, I thought you were going to mention the health of the other animals that in the herd that the collared elephant is in. But that's another aspect of health that these collars could give us, the body condition of animals. So I think it's got a lot of potential, and I'd love to explore that going forward in our future collaring efforts.
Yeah, I could. That would be really interesting. If you do, please let me know. I'd love to have you back on the podcast to talk about that. But moving on slightly from cameras and other sensors, do you think any of these findings could be related to the movements of other large mammals in the same environment?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a question that that does bedevil the field a little bit. So you might produce, as we think we've done, a really great study on connectivity for one particular species, but it's always a bit of an open question as to how the results for that one species compare to other species. And while there is good reason to expect that a number of other species, might show similar types of preferences for elephants, at least in terms of their avoidance of sort of human-dominated parts of the landscape. We know that different species have different habitat preferences, have different behaviors, have different, resource needs, and so on. So, I think it would be ideal if we could replicate this type of study for elephants for a suite of other species that, we're never going to be able to do this, even for a tiny minority of all the species that are out there. But if we could do it for a subset of species, that capture sort of maybe some of the main guilds of large wildlife that are out there on the landscape, that would really, I think, give us more confidence that, the results that we've generated for elephants are robust and can be, are similar to the needs that other wildlife species have.
You mentioned connectivity again there, and which has been a focus of the conversation. And earlier on in the conversation, you talked about using some ideas from the human transport when we look at connectivity in a transport network for us humans. And I was just curious, what is the relationship between those two things? Is there any, or is it just, they use these tools when we look at connectivity for human transport networks, we could maybe use the same tools? Or were there any sort of crossover theories that you could use or methodologies?
Yeah, I think in terms of the theory, it's actually interesting. So much like people, elephants will habitually use some of the same highways, if you'd like to call it that. These elephant highways, you can actually map, the more heavily used of them out via satellite imagery because they're so consistently used. And elephants is obviously the largest land mammal out there. They make a pretty obvious track when they're using areas consistently. So in the sense that, we people do the same things and have our roads and trails and paths, elephants are similar in that way. But I think one of the, from a methodological point of view, it was really that with data on people and how they move around and, people's iPhones pinging every minute and sending data somewhere that someone is incorporating and analyzing, the methods to analyze and visualize in particular, these huge data sets are pretty well developed. But, for the reasons we discussed earlier, there typically isn't that amount of data in the animal world. We did have that amount of data. We had, about 4 million GPS points, which are very difficult to make sense of, if you just plot them in the most simplistic way possible. So using some of these, these ways to really draw out the patterns that we see, the movement patterns. Yeah, it was I think an interesting application of some of the methods that are used in the human transportation literature.
So we keep coming back to this idea in a perfect world we'd have more data. And again, taking nothing away from the huge amount of work you've done on this incredible data set. But in a perfect world, it would have higher resolution, higher spatial resolution, higher temporal resolution. Maybe we'd have other sensors. And when we think about the way you mentioned iPhones before, the way we track humans and the kind of sensors we see popping up on all kinds of devices and vehicles, do you see the same kind of innovation happening in the world of tracking animals? Are we constantly evolving the way these sensors work, the way they are attached? I don't know, the power of them?
Things are definitely evolving. So, in an ideal world, your GPS collar would be lighter, it would last longer, it would take more fixes, and it would be cheaper. And we see advances in all of those things, at different rates and, for different species. But that kind of advance is happening. And so, I anticipate that another decade from now, many of those factors will be a lot more advanced than they were, say, a decade and a half previously when we started this study. But I think the other aspect to animal tracking that could really be improved is assessing the environment through which these animals are moving. So we're in a bit of a funny position that we actually sort of tend to have better spatial and temporal resolution on where these animals are moving than on the environment that they're moving through. And so, things like, what is the land cover? What is the human land use around this area? What's the weather like? Trying to harness all of that information and get it at the hourly scale, at the seasonal scale, how it changes from year to year. I think there can be a big leap in that. And these tools are out there. You see some of the products now from Google in terms of their buildings data set, in terms of their continuous temporal land mapping, things like that. I think we need to start to do a better job of integrating these other environmental sensors with the GPS sensors that are on animals. And that, again, I think will really help us unlock more of the factors that are driving the animal movements that we see.
Interesting. My focus there, obviously, with that question was completely on the idea of increasing the spatial temporal rate of tracking of the actual thing as opposed to the environment that they're moving through. That's really good observation. Well, we've come a long way in the conversation. It's been fascinating, interesting, and I guess there's just a couple of things left to sort of clarify. And one being, where can people go? Is there a paper published? Is there a website that they can visit to read more about this, about your work?
Yeah, Daniel, there's been a paper published in the Journal of Applied Ecology that's open access, and so anyone can read it. And so I'll share that link with you, as well as a couple of news items and blog posts that have been associated with the article. And yeah, I would love to hear the feedback that your listeners might have on our work.
That'd be wonderful if you could send them over to me. I'll put them as links in the show notes of this episode and distribute them with the podcast. I wonder, though, if you could just share some final thoughts with us just before we let you go. And I guess, considering all of the work that you've done on this huge data set and the collaboration that's taken place behind the scenes, what would you like to leave the listeners with in terms of what is the big takeaway from this? Or what was your final thought when you look back on this project?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a little bit of a difficult one to answer, just because there were so many elements to the project. There was the collaboration effort and building the trust, and honestly, that took the lion's share of the project. When we first started this project in 2016, we had people. I specifically remember at the first meeting we had people saying, "Look, don't bother. You're never going to be able to get people who've collected this elephant data to share it. It's just not how it works." And so, one of the most gratifying things to me is that, that observation, though it was well intentioned, was in fact not true, and we did manage to overcome those hurdles. So that was something that was, me personally as a scientist who likes to work in teams with collaborators, that was really gratifying. The other thing is I think we were able to really achieve some fundamental insights, not so much in the sort of the hardcore statistics and the very sophisticated modeling, but merely through taking the data and sort of trying to visualize it in different ways. So this, using these approaches from the human transportation literature is one. One thing we didn't talk about is animating the data into these movement animations where you get a dynamic visualization of what's happening with elephant movement. And there are links to those animations that I'll also share with you, Daniel, so you can pass to your listeners. But I think, all in all, it's difficult to pinpoint one particular thing that I took away from this 8+ years of work since I started with this project. But I think it's this mix of collaboration and data visualization that, to me, were the things that I learned the most from.
Wonderful. Hey, Robin, I want to say thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much for your work. You're doing valuable work here, and I hope that it goes on to make a difference. So I'm sure it will, but I really hope people sit up and take notice of this and use it to, like I said, to make things better. So really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate you having me on your show. And yeah, I really appreciate those comments as well.
Really hope you enjoyed that episode with Robin, lead scientist at the World Wildlife Fund US. As mentioned in the introduction, I'll put links to some articles that have been published about this field study that I think you might find interesting. I'll also link to something called MoveBank, which is a free online database of animal tracking data that I think you will find interesting. I haven't spent a lot of time in there myself, but from what I've seen, it looks fascinating. And if any of you take the time to explore that and start creating or doing something with that data, I would really love to hear about it. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. I'll be back again soon. I hope that you'll take the time to join me then.